that the unique life force they believed in actually existed, and that organic compounds were basically different from inorganic ones, as they asserted. Thousands of experiments were conducted, but from the vitalist perspective, all of them eventually failed. In 1828, the German scientist Friedrich Wöhler succeeded in synthesizing urea, demonstrating that there was no basic difference between organic and inorganic compounds. However, vitalism remained strong in many scientific quarters until well into the 20th century. Louis Pasteur, the inventor of pasteurization and of other things, one of the greatest scientists of the 19th century, believed that fermentation was a peculiarly vital action that could not occur without living beings such as live yeast. I'm given to understand that it's only fairly recently that fermentation has been made to occur with dead yeast, or with the products of dead yeast. So I mentioned a few of the other notable vitalists. Johannes Peter Müller, who published an influential manual of physiology. Mentioning physiology, physiology was a kind of separate discipline in these days, and it had a special inclination to be vitalistic. The physiologists as a group tended to be vitalists, even when the chemists were not, for example. So Müller explains that the presence of a soul makes each organism an indivisible whole. Johannes Reinke, who lived, as you see, well into the 20th century, was a proponent of scientific neo-vitalism, which Carl Jung says was an influence, a serious influence on himself. Oscar Hertwig, who made important discoveries in zoology, such as the role of the cell nucleus in inheritance. A particularly famous name in these circumstances was Hans Driesch, who, as you see, lived until 1941, who showed by experiments on sea urchin eggs that some cells can generate every cell in an organism, giving rise to the distinction between totipotent and pluripotent cells. Searching for a theory to explain his experimental results, he eventually adopted Aristotle's theory of teleology, which, as you will have noticed, has played a part in these lectures. He also gave 2 series of Gifford lectures. Another well-known name is John Scott Haldane, a Scottish physiologist, there are the physiologists again, who, among other achievements, invented the gas mask and the oxygen tent during the First World War, and made many interesting discoveries in the study of gases. He wrote that the organism is, quote, a self-regulating entity, unquote, and, quote, every effort to analyze it into components that can be reduced to a mechanical explanation violates this central experience. Quote, we must find a different theoretical basis of biology, based on the observation that all the phenomena concerned tend towards being so coordinated that they express what is normal for an adult organism. The greatest philosopher of vitalism is usually thought to be Henri Bergson, who wrote, well, he wrote a number of famous books, but especially, from our viewpoint, Creative Evolution, published in 1907, and The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, 1932. many other ways. Well, Bergson was a great influence in philosophy, in Western philosophy during the 20th century. It's very clear, if you read Bergson, that he was an influence on Heidegger, for example. A lot of people don't realize this, but it just comes out very plainly if you read both of them. Well, a couple of recent vitalist works I just mentioned here in passing: Rupert Sheldrake, A New Science of Life, The Hypothesis of Formative Causation, published 1981, and James Lefanu, Why Us? How Science Rediscovered the Mystery of Ourselves, published only in 2009. Now, what all of these vitalists had in common was an assumption that belief in the existence of a life force belonged within the purview of science, that it was a scientific concept which ought to be proved by scientific methods and eventually accepted by scientists and incorporated into the body of scientific knowledge. And despite all this support, at the end of the day, the decisive factor has been that the existence of life and the uniqueness of the life force has not been able to be established by the procedures of scientific method, through empirical testing and experiment. The great biologist Ernst Mayr, a German who became an American and is one of the founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis, has made some interesting comments on this situation. On the one hand, he agrees that the vitalists make a very important point. It would be ahistorical, he says, to ridicule vitalists. When one reads the writings of one of the leading vitalists, like Driesch, one is forced to agree with him that many of the basic problems of biology simply cannot be solved by a philosophy like that of Descartes, in which the organism is simply considered a machine. The developmental biologists in particular ask some very challenging questions. For example, how can a machine regenerate lost parts, as many kinds of organisms are able to do? How can a machine replicate itself? How can two machines fuse into a single one, like the fusion of two gametes when producing a zygote? The logic of the vitalist critique, says Mayr, was impeccable. But on the other hand, Mayr considers that their enterprise was a failure for two reasons. First, they could never prove their ideas scientifically. And second, their postulate of a special life force in living things is no longer needed or serves any useful purpose. The end of vitalism came, he writes, when it could no longer find any supporters. Two causes were largely responsible for this. First, the failure of literally thousands of failed experiments conducted to prove the existence of a Lebenskraft. And secondly, the realization that the new biology, with the methods of genetics and molecular biology, was able to solve all the problems for which one traditionally had invoked the Lebenskraft, life force. In other words, the proposal of a Lebenskraft had simply become unnecessary.
So when was Ernst Mayr?
Well, he just...
What years was he?
Oh, he lived a long life and died not all that long ago. his initial...
Early 20th century.
Oh, no, he's lived since the Second World War. Well, he came to the US during the 30s, published a number of books in the 50s, and he was producing until just a couple of years ago. It's only 3 or 4 years, I think, since he died. So according to the view that I'm defending, both of these alleged causes are mistaken. But because the term vitalism now carries with it so much baggage, I don't refer to my own theory as vitalist. Now recently, a celebrated member of our group, Professor Paul Liebman, has raised the important similar question: what use is the idea of teleological causation when everything can be accounted for by mechanistic causation? What do we gain from accepting the existence of a special life force when everything can be explained scientifically without it? And my answer is that for science, nothing is to be gained. But for humanity, everything. First, for science. For science, nothing. Science is fine the way it is. It's a great success within its domain. It should keep doing what it has been doing. We do not propose to change science in any way. But, and this is a big but, both the vitalists and their critics have assumed that the phenomenon of life must fall within the purview of science. So my response is that this is a profound mistake. It does not. The intrinsic reality of life cannot be grasped in the test tube or under the microscope. We know what it means to be alive by living. Science must always treat life as if it were a mechanism. But this has been immensely beneficial to us, and science should continue to do this, because life manifests itself and acts upon the world by employing mechanisms. Philosophy is no substitute for science. But secondly, for humanity, however, everything is gained by recognizing teleological causation and the distinct reality of life or the life force. Since all the qualities that are most distinctive of human beings are teleological and are dependent on the life force. These include mind, free will, personhood, and the entire domain of ethics and morality, as well as spontaneity and imagination. Our knowledge of this comes not from scientific experiments, but from our direct interior experience of ourselves, beginning with our experience of the freedom of our will to make choices. A world without freedom of the will, a world of machines, is not a human world. If philosophy is no substitute for science, science is no substitute for ethics, for philosophy, or for poetry. Now, there is an important and crucial question of logic at stake. As we saw earlier, a machine cannot do good or evil, and cannot make judgments of good or evil. Unlike life and teleological causation, which immediately implies value, the concept of mechanistic causation contains no reference to value and no basis for it. Logically, there is no room in a mechanistic universe for the concept of good, and therefore no room for the concept of bad. Mechanists who continue to use these ideas are guilty of incoherence. Maya, to the contrary, notwithstanding, the proposal of natural purposes and a life force is indispensable for a human world. Well, the ultimate explanation of this level of reality is another question which I don't address in these lectures, but plan to investigate in a further series.